The millionaire hid cameras to protect his disabled triplets, until he saw what the maid did. 2 years earlier, Ethan Mercer stood inside the cold delivery room of a Portland hospital, his hands shaking so violently he could hardly recognize them as the hands of a trauma surgeon who had saved hundreds of lives. The smell of antiseptic, the beeping monitors, the blinding white light, everything crashed into him at once like a violent wave. And at the center of that chaos was Laura, his wife, the woman whose smile softened every edge of his world, lying motionless on the operating table. She had just given birth, 3 babies, 3 tiny miracles he hadn't even seen clearly yet. And then suddenly, brutally, her body gave out. Blood. Too much blood. Ethan had handled catastrophic injuries, had stared death in the face countless times, had held a beating heart in his hands while fighting to keep it alive. But when the person dying was the woman he loved, every skill he had ever learned turned to dust. He performed compressions, called for more blood, barked orders to the staff. No one reacted faster than him. No one knew more than him. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could bring her back. Laura died 40 minutes after their 3 children were born. Ethan held her hand until her skin turned cold, until the familiar lines of her palms stiffened beneath his fingers. He didn't know how long he sat there. Time either stopped, or maybe he had simply slipped out of it altogether, floating inside a pain that had no shape. When a nurse finally approached and asked, "Would you like to see the babies?" Ethan didn't answer. He only stood, body heavy as stone, and followed her like someone sleepwalking. The 3 infants were so small he feared looking at them too hard might break them. John, Samuel, and Jonah, fragile beings surrounded by tubes and machines, breathing weakly, their eyes barely open. Ethan pressed his hand against the NICU glass, as if the warmth of his palm could tether them to the world their mother had just left behind. Then the pediatric neurologist entered. His voice was gentle, but each word crashed like a hammer. All 3 babies had severe cerebral palsy caused by oxygen deprivation during birth. Deep injury, global motor impact, the likelihood of standing or walking, extremely low, possibly never. Ethan heard the words, but his mind was blank. He didn't ask questions, didn't argue, didn't demand alternatives. For every other patient he had ever treated, he would have fought like a storm, questioning, analyzing, refusing to surrender. But now, he was burying his wife inside his own thoughts. And at the same time, he was being told that his children would never run on the beach together, never stand on their own legs. The weeks that followed were a blur. Paperwork, Laura's funeral, the heavy footsteps returning to the coastal home she once loved, because the ocean sounds like freedom whispering. But now the house echoed with emptiness. When the babies were finally stable enough to come home, Ethan walked into the nursery, 3 cribs Laura had chosen, each color and pattern picked with love, and his chest tightened until breathing hurt. He held John first, fragile as paper. Samuel, even weaker. Jonah, the smallest, barely opening his eyes. 3 beings who depended entirely on a man who felt he had nothing left. Ethan looked at them, and for the first time in his life, a man who had faced death head-on countless times felt utterly powerless. That was the day the strongest part of him began to die, and the day he buried hope beside Laura. In the first days after bringing the 3 babies home to the coastal estate in Oregon, Ethan Mercer felt as though he were living inside a fogged-over dream, a dream he didn't want to wake from, yet didn't have the strength to continue. He followed every procedure, feeding schedules, respiratory monitors, medical logs, every instruction the specialists gave. But his heart seemed to hover somewhere outside his body. Each motion, each step, felt as if someone else were performing it in his place. The house Laura once loved, with its soft waves and gentle afternoon light, was now so cold that even breathing sounded like a quiet lament. Ethan placed 3 tiny cribs in their primary bedroom, the same room where he and Laura had once spent hours planning their children's future. But within weeks, the cribs were replaced with 3 miniature wheelchairs lined up beneath the pallid white lights of the therapy room. Laura had chosen the blankets, the stuffed animals. Now all of it sat untouched in a corner like misplaced decorations in a life too cruel to allow them meaning. Days passed like tides rising and falling. Nothing changed. The boys didn't roll, didn't lift their heads, didn't babble. Each evaluation brought the same verdicts. No progress, low muscle tone, weak reflexes, minimal voluntary movement. Ethan cycled through specialist after specialist, spending thousands in exchange for the faintest spark of hope. Try this device. Schedule another therapy session. But each attempt ended the same, hope tossed into the ocean, swallowed without a trace. One night, Ethan stood in the nursery Laura had spent an entire summer decorating. The blue whales still swam across the wall. Stars still glowed faintly overhead. But instead of laughter, the air was filled with the scent of dust and medical plastic. The rocking chair, where Laura once said, "I'm going to hold all 3 here at once," was covered in a thin sheet. Ethan placed his hand on the armrest and whispered to a ghost, "I'm sorry. Laura, I'm so sorry." After that night, he rarely returned to the room. Then he stopped entering other rooms too. The 20-plus room estate shrank to 3 lit spaces, the kitchen, his bedroom, and the office where the glow of security monitors washed a cold blue over his hollow face every night. Every evening, Ethan wandered the dim hallways, his footsteps echoing with the emptiness of someone existing without living. Sometimes he paused outside the therapy room, catching a glimpse through the cracked door. 3 small bodies motionless in their wheelchairs. Sometimes he wondered whether they felt the loneliness of this place, or whether they had already grown used to silence. In his mind, one sentence repeated endlessly. I failed them all, and every time it returned, he felt hope inside him die a little more. 18 months passed, slow enough to erode a man's heart, fast enough that Ethan Mercer barely realized how exhausted he had become. In that time, he hired 11 caregivers. 11 times he opened the door to hope, and 11 times he watched it flicker out like a candle smothered by a violent gust. The first arrived with a gentle smile and eyes full of sympathy. But 2 weeks later, she stood before Ethan clutching her small bag, voice trembling. I'm sorry, I can't handle it. Seeing the boys like this, it hurts too much. Ethan only nodded. He didn't plead, didn't resent her. He understood. He barely handled it himself. The second was different. No sadness, no sympathy, just emptiness. One afternoon, Ethan stepped into the therapy room and found her sitting cross-legged on a chair, eyes glued to her phone, laughing softly while his 3 sons lay motionless behind her. What are you doing? Ethan asked, his voice icy. She jerked upright, hiding her phone. I was just... You're fired. Nothing more needed saying. The third made Ethan believe he had finally found the right person, until several vials of morphine vanished from the medical cabinet. When confronted, she forced a smile. Probably a mistake in my notes. But Ethan had been a doctor. He knew the difference between an error and a lie. The fourth did the unthinkable, secretly photographed his equipment and sold the images to a trashy tabloid. The headline hit him like a blow. Mystery in the coastal mansion, wealthy father and his sick children. Ethan stared at the article, hands turning pale around the phone. He wasn't angry. Something inside him simply broke loose. The fifth left the deepest cut. She pretended to care, gentle, attentive, soft-spoken. Ethan nearly trusted her. But on a stormy night, one of his bank accounts was breached. The first person to disappear was her. Ethan stood in the dark living room watching unauthorized transaction alerts blink across his screen. He exhaled slowly, too tired to rage. The next caregivers, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, came and went like shadows. One feared the sound of monitoring machines. One avoided touching the boys entirely. One abandoned her shift halfway through. Each departure carved another wound into Ethan's already decaying trust. Eventually, he realized he no longer saw these people as human. They were threats. A smile made him suspicious. A casual sentence felt like deceit. A simple touch on his children's shoulders made him bolt upright to check the cameras. So he installed cameras everywhere. Therapy room, living room, hallways, even the secondary kitchen. At night, instead of sleeping, he sat before the monitors replaying every movement. Every raised eyebrow, every sideways glance was dissected as if it were evidence of a crime waiting to happen. "No one is trustworthy," Ethan whispered into countless empty nights, his voice bleeding like an open wound. And tragically, he believed that more than anything else in this world. The day Maya Hart stepped into the coastal mansion, the Oregon sky was covered with a thin gray veil, like a sheet of fog draped across the horizon. The ocean wasn't loud, just a quiet rhythm of waves, as if it too were watching the house, waiting to see how it would react to the arrival of someone new. Maya stood at the door, hands tucked into her coat sleeves, eyes calm and observant, as though houses with hidden wounds weren't anything new to her. Ethan Mercer opened the door. He stood straight, no smile, no warmth, just a curt nod. Ever since losing Laura, he had forgotten how to welcome anyone with anything resembling kindness. "Ms. Hart?" he said, voice flat. "Yes, I'm Maya." Her voice was soft, low, steady, carrying a confidence that unsettled Ethan, as if she understood the battlefield she was stepping into and wasn't afraid. He led her through the long hallway, their shadows stretching across the cold stone walls. "I'll be clear," Ethan said, without looking back. "No creativity, no improvising, no changing anything on your own." "Yes?" "No emotional attachment. The boys need stability, not meaningless hope." "I understand." "And you'll follow exactly what the doctors prescribed, 100%. No more, no less." Maya paused, lifting her gaze to him. 100%, she repeated. But in her eyes, there was something that made Ethan uncomfortable, as if she accepted his rules but didn't believe in them. He opened the therapy room door. The three boys sat in their wheelchairs, washed in pale white light. Maya walked over, lowered herself to their eye level, and her face softened, so gently it seemed the entire world had gone quiet to make room for that tenderness. "Hello, little ones," she whispered. Ethan stood behind her, chest tightening. The way she looked at his sons, it was a way he no longer dared to look, with belief. That night, after Maya returned to the staff wing, Ethan sat in his office. The wall in front of him glowed with security camera feeds. With a tap, he watched Maya adjust therapy toys, secure straps, lean down to say something to Samuel the camera couldn't catch. Ethan crossed his arms, eyes locked on the screen. "She's just like the others," he told himself. "She'll show her real face eventually." And like every night before, he sat there waiting for that moment, the moment he believed was inevitable. In the first days, Maya Hart followed every rule Ethan had set, at least on the surface. But then the small things began to appear. Acts so gentle, so subtle they seemed harmless, yet powerful enough to make Ethan sit up straighter in his office chair, eyes fixed on the security feed. On her fourth morning, just as the sun peeked over the pines behind the mansion, Maya placed a small speaker on the shelf. With a single tap, soft piano music spilled into the therapy room, warm, delicate, fragile as silk, completely at odds with the sterile coldness of the space. Ethan narrowed his eyes at the monitor. "Not in the protocol," he muttered. His finger hovered over the intercom, then dropped. The melody was too gentle to justify anger. By the 6th day, Maya no longer started therapy immediately. She sat cross-legged on the floor before the boys, hands resting on her knees, leaning slightly toward them. 10 minutes, doing nothing, just observing, just being present. The room felt so still that the distant ocean sounded loud. "She's wasting time," Ethan whispered, but he kept watching. Then came the children's storybooks. Bright covers, colorful pages, Maya's voice low and soothing, almost like a lullaby. "John, do you think the little rabbit can fly?" she asked softly. No one believes him, but he keeps trying. Ethan leaned back in his chair, uneasy for reasons he couldn't name. "They don't understand," he muttered. But he didn't shut off the feed. And then the first reactions appeared. On a gray morning, as the piano played, John slowly turned his head toward the sound. Small, but unmistakable. Ethan jolted upright. Impossible! That afternoon, Samuel, the least responsive of the three, twitched his middle finger when Maya brought a tiny red toy car close to him. A movement so small most people wouldn't have seen it. But Maya did. Her eyes brightened. "Good job, sweetheart. Yes, that's it," she whispered. Then Jonah, the one who spent most days half asleep, opened his eyes longer than usual. Not 2 seconds, not 3. Almost 10, long enough for his gaze to meet Maya's face. "Hello, little one," she murmured, her smile soft as sea wind. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" Ethan watched everything from the monitor. Each time he considered pressing the call button, he hesitated. His hand trembled slightly, and he didn't understand why. "No," he told himself, "she's breaking my rules." But the more he watched, the harder it was to look away. There was something in Maya's gentleness, in the way she waited for the smallest signs, as if she were waiting for the first sprout to rise through winter soil. That made Ethan feel he was witnessing something he had buried long ago, the possibility of change. And what unsettled him most was that he was no longer sure he wanted to stop her. Night settled over the Oregon coastal mansion like a cold blanket, and Ethan Mercer sat alone in his office, the only room where he could bear the darkness. No lights, just the blue glow from the security monitors washing over his face, making him look like someone stepping out of an unfinished dream he didn't want to wake from. He replayed the footage of Maya reading to the boys that afternoon. She sat on the rug with the book open on her lap, her voice warm and steady, soft enough to make the sterile room feel almost livable. John followed her movements with his eyes. Samuel tilted his head slightly, as if trying to catch every word. And Jonah, the baby who usually slept through everything, kept his eyes open so long that Ethan replayed the clip 3 times to make sure he wasn't imagining it. He leaned back, letting out a long breath. And in that moment, he remembered who he used to be, years ago. The surgeon who could stand in an operating room for 14 hours. The man who believed quitting was never an option. That man had been full of hope, full of fight. Now he was nothing but someone wearing a shell called Ethan Mercer, hollow beneath it. A breathing shadow. The camera switched angles, unintentionally catching the cracked door of the nursery, the room he hadn't entered in nearly a year. Just seeing the sliver of that door tightened his chest until it hurt to breathe. He could still hear Laura there sometimes, her laugh, her voice imagining their son's futures, her choosing the whale mural. All of it played like an old film he didn't have the courage to continue watching. But Maya, a woman who had never known Laura, never tasted this loss, walked into that world as if there were no ghosts at all. She looked at his boys the way he couldn't, fully present, believing, holding something he had lost long ago. Ethan covered his eyes, fingers trembling. A familiar ache surged up, hot like fire, yet leaving him cold. God, he whispered, it should have been me. The night stayed silent. Only the distant waves answered, reminding him that it wasn't Maya making him hurt. It was the reflection of everything he had abandoned. A light veil of morning fog draped over the backyard of the coastal mansion as Maya Hart rolled out a cream-colored mat across the therapy room floor. From the office upstairs, Ethan watched her through the security camera feed and felt an immediate tension coil beneath his ribs. She placed small objects in front of the boys one by one, a wooden block, a soft ball, a frayed yellow stuffed animal. Nothing about her setup followed any treatment plan he had ever seen. No structure he recognized. No protocol. Then Maya began. She crouched beside John, slid her hands gently under his legs, and guided them in slow stepping motions. Her movements were soft yet intentional, as if she were introducing his muscles to a language they had never been allowed to speak. Ethan leaned toward the screen, breath caught, a knot forming in his throat. "No!" "Maya, don't," he muttered, reaching toward the intercom button, but freezing just before touching it. She continued with Samuel, then Jonah. The piano music she played was barely audible, a quiet thread of warmth weaving through the cold medical sterility of the room. Ethan felt his entire body tighten. Every motion she made sliced through the rigid system he'd built, the rules that kept him from falling apart, the structure that kept hope out. He rose from his chair, ready to storm downstairs and put an end to all of it, but the moment he reached the office door, a sound stopped him. A laugh, thin, trembling, fragile, but unmistakably a laugh. He spun back to the screen. John was laughing because Maya tapped lightly against the bottom of his foot to trigger a reflex, laughing like his body had discovered joy for the first time. Ethan stepped backward, dizzy, gripping the chair for balance. No, this can't be real. But the changes didn't stop. Throughout the week, Samuel began trying to grab the red block, clumsy, shaky, intentional. Jonah, the frailest, held his head up longer, his eyes following Maya around the room. John turned toward sound every time she called his name. To someone else, these were small. To Ethan, they were earthquakes. When the physical therapist arrived for the scheduled evaluation, Ethan watched from behind the one-way glass as always. The doctor checked John, then Samuel, then Jonah, and his expression shifted sharply. He examined again. And again. Finally, he called out, voice cracking, "Ethan, look at this. This is real. Significant progress." Ethan stepped into the room but stopped short, chest heaving. The words should have lifted him. Instead, they flooded him with panic. If Maya was right, if the doctors had been wrong for 2 years, if progress had been possible all along, then what had he done? What kind of father had he been? The terror surged, overwhelming any spark of hope. He turned sharply toward Maya. "Stop." His voice was harsher than he intended. "Stop everything, right now." Maya looked up, not startled, almost expecting this. "Mr. Mercer, What exactly do you think you're doing?" Ethan stepped closer, hands trembling. "I said no improvising, no new techniques. You're not a doctor. You don't get to experiment on my kids." Maya stood slowly, wiping her hands on her pants, her gaze steady. "You're right. I'm not a doctor." "Then you don't know anything," Ethan snapped, anger cracking through fear. But Maya didn't flinch. "I know neuroplasticity," she said, her voice calm but unshakably firm. "I know that a child's brain can build new pathways when challenged correctly. The damage is real, Ethan, but so is their ability to adapt. Children aren't limited by charts." Ethan slammed his palm against the equipment cabinet, the sound sharp and desperate. "You're dreaming. You're giving them false hope." "They're 2 years old, Ethan." Maya stepped forward, lowering her voice. "They don't understand false hope. They only understand whether someone believes in them. Silence filled the room, heavy, unforgiving. Ethan looked at his sons. They were looking at Maya, not him. Pain spread through his chest like something tearing loose. He turned away, unable to bear what he saw, unable to bear what it meant. He walked out. The door closed softly behind him. Not a slam, not an ending. And he didn't fire her. Night fell over the Oregon coast with a stillness so deep Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. He sat alone in his office, the lamp long switched off, leaving only the cold glow of his laptop lighting his face like a ghost caught between decisions. On the screen was a termination letter, half a sentence that had lingered for an hour. Maya Hart, starting tomorrow. Then deleted. Typed again. Deleted again. Every time the cursor returned to the beginning, Ethan felt something hollow tighten inside him. "Why can't I finish this?" he whispered, the words heavy as gravel. Unable to bear the weight pressing on his ribs, he opened the security app out of habit. The therapy room appeared. 11 o'clock at night. The lights were still on. Ethan leaned forward. Maya sat on the floor between the boys, legs crossed, her posture protective, like she was shielding something fragile. No exercises, no equipment, just her and the 3 toddlers resting into her presence as if it were the safest place they knew. She was singing. The camera barely caught the sound, but Ethan saw her lips move, saw the softness in her expression, and he could almost feel the warmth in her voice. Like every note was a thread pulling them toward life. She touched John's hand, brushed Samuel's hair, then turned to Jonah, the smallest, the weakest. She lifted his tiny hand, almost weightless, and pressed it gently against her cheek, closing her eyes as if giving him permission to touch a heart beating for him. "You're not broken, Jonah," she whispered, her lips forming words the microphone couldn't. "You're just waiting, and I'll wait with you, as long as you need." 1 second, 2. Then the world slipped from under Ethan's feet. He sank into his chair, hand covering his mouth. Something inside him cracked, quietly but devastatingly, as if a truth buried for 2 years finally forced its way to the surface. Maya's tiny whisper had exposed the largest void in his life. "It should have been me," he breathed, sounding like a confession. With trembling hands, he opened his browser. He typed, misspelled, typed again. Neuroplasticity, gait simulation therapy, early intervention, CP. Study after study appeared. He devoured them, desperate, guilty, shaking. And he understood. Maya wasn't reckless. She was right. And he, the surgeon who once swore never to give up, had been the first to walk away. He stood abruptly, almost stumbling into the hallway. He moved toward the east wing, toward the door he had avoided for 18 months. The nursery, the place where everything had begun and ended. His hand shook on the doorknob. The room opened to dust and moonlight. 3 cribs arranged in a half-circle, exactly how Laura had placed them. Her hand-painted whales swimming across the wall. The rocking chair she loved still in the corner, draped with the shawl she wore on quiet nights. Ethan stood frozen, breath trapped in his throat. "Laura, I'm sorry." And in that moonlit room, he finally allowed himself to break. Ethan remained in the nursery far longer than he intended, as if his body had forgotten how to walk away. The room, with its empty cribs and the whale mural Laura had spent 2 weeks painting, no longer suffocated him. Instead, it revealed something else. A part of his heart had never left this place, even while he'd been running from it for so long. When he returned to the hallway, dawn light filtered through the windows, soft, warm, gentler than any morning he'd seen in years. He stood still, fingers lingering on the cold metal of the doorknob. Something in him was opening, slowly, trembling, but undeniably real. The next morning, Ethan drifted toward the east wing without thinking. He didn't enter the therapy room. He simply stood outside, shoulder against the wall, listening. Inside, Maya's soft piano played like wind, moving through pine trees. Then the clink of toys. And then a laugh, then another, and a third. Ethan closed his eyes. Those sounds pierced through the invisible armor he had worn for 2 years, armor made of fear, numbness, and guilt. The laughter rose, clear and uninvited, as if the boys were calling him back to a life he had believed he no longer deserved. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "tomorrow I'll walk into that room, I promise." The promise felt small, but true, like the first sprout breaking through soil Ethan thought was dead. That afternoon, while he was making coffee, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Motion alert. A sound he'd heard thousands of times, but this time something inside him tightened. He opened the app, breath held in his chest. The image froze him in place. 3 wheelchairs. Empty. All of them. Shifted slightly, as if nudged aside by tiny hands. The screen blurred for a moment because Ethan's own hands had started shaking. No, that can't be," he whispered. He scrolled the footage back a few seconds. And then his entire world shattered in a way no doctor had ever prepared him for. John was standing, knees shaking, arms out for balance. His head turned toward Maya when she called his name, a simple motion that had once been impossible. Samuel stood leaning slightly, fighting to keep his head up, lips pressed tight in concentration. Every tremor in his leg sent another shock through Ethan's chest. And Jonah, the child Ethan had quietly prepared his heart to never see walk, was stepping toward Maya. One long step, one short step, then another. His cheeks flushed with effort, but his eyes bright as if he'd just discovered the sky. Ethan's phone slipped from his hand, hitting the kitchen floor with a sharp crack. His knees gave out before he understood what he was doing. Tears spilled freely, hot and relentless, landing on the cold tile in broken shapes. "My boys," he choked, the words trembling. "You're doing it. You're really doing it." He pushed himself upright, barely feeling the ground beneath him. He ran, down the long hallway, past the rooms that once held all his fear, toward the living room as if his heart were in there and needed him this very second. Ethan ran toward the living room, breath breaking in his chest. He didn't remember turning the doorknob or pushing the door open, just the feeling of his legs locking when the scene inside hit him like a quiet explosion. Maya was sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around the 3 boys pressed against her chest. All 3 of them were panting, faces flushed from the greatest effort of their lives. Yet their tiny mouths still curved upward, proud, almost triumphant. And Maya, hair messy, cheeks streaked with tears, lifted her head the moment she sensed Ethan. Her expression wasn't surprised. It wasn't afraid. It was the calm recognition of someone who had been waiting for him to arrive. Ethan slowed, then dropped to his knees in front of them. His knees touched the wooden floor with a soft thud that echoed inside him like the cracking of an old shell. "How?" he whispered, voice breaking. "How did you know they could do it?" Maya looked at him, a small, quiet smile warming her face. "I didn't know," she murmured. "I just believed." Her words hit him gently, but deeply enough to collapse every wall he'd built around himself. Ethan leaned forward and wrapped his arms around the 3 boys. Their little bodies trembled against his chest, as if they, too, felt the return of someone who had been gone too long. He closed his eyes, tears falling into their soft hair. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I gave up before you even had the chance to try." John shifted in his arms. Samuel lifted a tiny hand to rest on his chest, a gesture so small, yet so forgiving, it nearly broke Ethan again. Jonah leaned into his shoulder, warm breath brushing Ethan's neck. When he opened his eyes, Maya was starting to rise, stepping back to give the family space. But before she could pull away, Ethan reached out and took her hand. "Maya," he said, voice rough. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't. Please, stay with us." Her eyes softened, as if he'd spoken something she had secretly hoped to hear. "I'll stay," she said softly, "as long as the boys need me." They sat together on the living room floor, 2 adults, 3 children, gathered into one warm circle Ethan never imagined he would touch again. Afternoon light spilled through the windows, painting everything gold. Against the far wall, the 3 wheelchairs sat quietly in the corner, no longer the center of anyone's life. Ethan looked at them, then at his sons resting in his arms, then at Maya, the woman who had refused to abandon hope when he had thrown it away. And in that moment he felt Laura, clearly, gently, proudly, as if she were placing her hand on his shoulder and whispering that he had found his way back, that he had finally become the man she always believed he could be. Ethan placed a hand over his heart and drew in a long, steady breath, not to push away pain, but to welcome the new life awakening inside him. Miracles don't ask for permission. They only need someone brave enough to believe. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Mercer believed. 3 years passed after that unforgettable afternoon. 3 years that Ethan Mercer no longer measured by calendars, but by the small changes within the coastal house, once filled only with silence and the sound of waves. John, Samuel, and Jonah no longer leaned on one another just to stay upright. Their steps were still unsteady, still supported by braces and patience, still marked by occasional painful falls. But every step belonged to them. Every morning, laughter rose before the alarm clock. Every evening, the house no longer felt cold. It breathed in rhythm with the lives growing inside it. Maya was still there, not as a caregiver, not as someone who came and would eventually leave. She stayed, quietly, steadily, until she became part of the home itself. During those 3 years, Ethan could not pinpoint the exact moment everything began to change. There was no single day to mark it. It happened gradually. He stopped watching Maya through security cameras. He stood beside her in the therapy room. He learned to sit on the floor, learned patience, learned how not to fear hope. And one evening, as the children slept and warm light reflected across the dark ocean outside the window, Ethan realized something that made his heart grow still. He was no longer alone. Maya sat on the sofa mending one of Jonah's old stuffed animals. The lamp softened her tired but peaceful face. Ethan watched her for a long moment, as if truly seeing the woman who had walked beside him for years without ever demanding to be noticed. "You know," he said quietly, "I once believed I was no longer capable of loving anyone again." Maya looked up but did not speak. She waited. "But maybe," Ethan continued, his voice slowing, "I've loved you for a long time already. I was just afraid to give it a name." Maya did not cry. She simply smiled, the gentle smile of someone who had never forced anything, not even love. Ethan proposed on a spring morning. There was no fine restaurant, no dazzling diamond ring, only the backyard garden where John, Samuel, and Jonah practiced walking in the early sunlight. Ethan knelt, his hands trembling, his words imperfect. "I can't promise to be the strongest man," he said, "but I promise to never walk away again, and I want to do that, with you." Maya said yes without hesitation. They were married in a simple ceremony by the Oregon coast. The wind was soft. The waves whispered. The 3 boys carried the rings in their small hands, walking slowly, unevenly, without help, because it was their path to walk. And then, 1 year later, the house welcomed a new cry. A baby girl was born into their arms, healthy, tiny, warm. Ethan held his daughter through the first night, quiet tears falling onto her soft hair. Not from pain, but from gratitude. He looked at Maya, at the 4 children sleeping peacefully, then out toward the ocean. The same ocean that had once witnessed him lose everything. Now it witnessed him being given far more than he had ever dared to hope for. Ethan placed a hand over his heart and drew a deep, steady breath, not to erase the old pain, but to make room for a new life, because miracles do not come to erase the past. They arrive when someone is brave enough to believe again. And this time, Ethan Mercer believed completely.